In the second kind of classic scenario that we present, the idea would be to transfer 100 gigabytes of data from one file system to another. And now you're in the regime where SCP doesn't really make sense, or SFTP, or rsync. So an example of this would be, typical examples would be model output, high-resolution data sets. A lot of satellite and radar data sets can get quite large. And at that point, doing those kinds of transfers with those utilities is just going to take too long. It's going to be prohibitive, and it's going to disrupt the workflow. So at this point, this is when Globus file transfers come into play. And this is really what it was designed to do, in addition to making data sharing just a more universal thing. But in terms of the transfer and infrastructure, this is kind of the sweet spot from 100 gigabytes and higher. So just a bit about Globus. If you've heard of GridFTP, it's basically another transfer protocol similar to SSH transfer protocols, which would be SCP or SFTP. It better suits large data management, and the way it does that is it supports parallel data streams. So instead of just transferring data across one stream from one system to another, it has multiple of these going on at the same time, and that's how it accelerates your transfer. So as long as a file system supports multiple data streams, and most do, you're going to get faster speeds. It also supports checkpointing to resume transfers if the connection is broken, and Globus does this pretty much automatically. If it detects that a transfer is interrupted for whatever reason, it will try to restart that transfer. So it has that SFTP functionality, but it's kind of the next level because it's managing it itself. One philosophical thing about Globus is it tries very much to be a behind-the-scenes type of thing. You just set up the transfer, and then it manages how many parallel data streams are going on. If there are any interruptions, it'll try to restart them, and basically just a set it and forget it kind of solution. So the Globus toolkit is one implementation of GridFTP, of this protocol. There are older implementations which are much harder to use. In fact, we don't document them anymore because it's quite laborious. And Globus does everything that you would want to do through that protocol. So it's really just a nice front end that's designed to make using this easier. And Globus Online provides a web-based GUI to ease the use even further. So that's why you don't have to use the command line interface if you don't want to. And in fact, you never have to log in your terminal to do a file transfer if that's your prerogative. So a Globus file transfer requires that both endpoints have GridFTP infrastructure. And that begs the question, what's an endpoint? So an endpoint is a source or a destination file system and a location on that file system for Globus transfers. So generally, always you're going to be transferring files from one endpoint to another. Systems must be configured to act as endpoints. If you're using one file system on an HPC system somewhere else and they don't have an endpoint set up, then if you want to use Globus, you're going to have to ask the sysadmins there to set up an endpoint. And I would say it's getting to the point where it's pretty ubiquitous now, but I remember 4 years ago I wanted to transfer data between two systems, the CU system and one of the national labs, and they didn't have an endpoint set up, so I ended up, at the time I used SCP, and it was very slow. So as long as there are endpoints at your location, you can use Globus. We have multiple endpoints for accessing Glade. So the NCAR Glade endpoint is the obvious one, and I would say when in doubt, use that one. Its intended purpose is to access the Glade file systems. If you use that endpoint, you will need to have a YubiKey, so you'll need to have access to Glade. There's another one, the NCAR Data Sharing Service. This is the endpoint that's used to allow outside users to access data, and typically there will be these things called shared endpoints, which I'll talk about later, but they point to a specific place within this data sharing pool so that you're not looking at an overwhelming amount of data, and it kind of constrains people to where they're looking. So for example, if I wanted to share some data with, it was wharf data with the wharf community, then I could set up an endpoint to just point at my wharf data, and it wouldn't look at everything in that data share. And then there's also the exceed NCAR Glade endpoint. So this can be used if you have exceed credentials. I would say if you don't know what exceed is, or if you do know what it is and you just don't have credentials, then don't worry about it, because again, we generally point people towards the Glade endpoint, the default. And as I said before, many universities and labs have endpoints on their systems too. And if you're a member of one of those universities or labs, you probably know about them, or if you have collaborators there. So again, for example, the University of Colorado Research Computing has an endpoint for Janus right now, soon to be Summit, their new supercomputer. That one's just called CU Boulder Research Computing if you're searching on the web interface. Labs also have endpoints including Lawrence Livermore, Los Alamos, Berkeley, Oak Ridge, others. NOAA has endpoints. For example, Israel has one. JPL at NASA has one, as well as some other NASA labs. And actually, your local workstation can also serve as an endpoint. This requires a little bit of extra setup and configuration, but it's nice because I can transfer then files to and from Glade from my laptop. And the speeds are still quite a bit faster than using SCP. When I did this earlier, I was going from, say, 10 to 20 megabytes per second with SCP, all the way up to 60 megabytes per second with Globus. So it's a pretty good boost. Now, obviously, when you're going to your laptop, when you're going to any system, but particularly when you're going to your laptop, that's going to depend strongly on the quality of your connection. So if you're trying to transfer data to and from your laptop at a coffee shop on Wi-Fi, that's still going to be the limiting factor. Okay. So at this point, I'm still going to go through the slides, but I'm also going to bring up the web interface as well as a terminal. So I would say if you have files that you want to try this on, feel free to follow along. If not, you can just follow my examples, but it's pretty easy to go through the interface. So if you want to do it while I'm doing it, that makes sense. So the first step to using the web interface is to obtain a login method. And we strongly recommend Globus ID, which isn't as intuitive as it used to be. This is actually one of my bugbears about Globus, is that I think that their login process is probably the most confusing aspect of the entire interface. But it tries to assume what you want it to do, which is not always what you want it to do. So if we go find the right desktop, I have too many open. Okay. So if we just go to globus.org, let me make this bigger for the remote viewers. This is the home page. So there's a lot on here, but the thing that you're really going to worry about typically is the login button. This just takes you to the actual interface you care about. So I'd click on that. And then assuming I haven't already logged in recently, it's going to take me to this page. And it's going to tell you to use your existing organizational login. Now, naively, I might think, okay, NCAR. And that gives me one result that says NCAR RDA. But we really don't, this isn't intended for NCAR, UCAR collaborators really to access Glade. This is intended for people outside of the outside of our infrastructure to access the research data archive. So we don't like people logging in by this method. There's also some functionality you lose by logging in by this method. Another thing you might try, and would work, is you could log in using your Google account. And if you're an NCAR employee, you have an organizational Google account. That works, but the preferred method is to use this Globus ID. Now, this does require you to create a new account, a Globus ID account, but there are advantages to it that I'll talk about later. In particular, if you want to use the command line interface, you need to have a Globus ID account. And if I go to the account page, I don't think there's anything sensitive here. it'll tell me that I'm using Globus ID. Now, if you already have a Globus account and it's through some other organization, you can actually link those existing accounts to your Globus ID, or whichever method you decide to choose. So if I, like for example, years ago I set up a Globus account with NCAR RDA because I was using RDA datasets. And I've since then linked that RDA account to the Globus ID. So now it just defaults to using Globus ID, which is the behavior that I want. And we'll come back to this part. Okay. So yeah, if you type NCAR, you're going to get this NCAR RDA option, but don't do that. Unless that's, that's what you want to do. If you're specifically using the RDA data archive, then absolutely. But if you're trying to transfer files to and from Glade, that's not the right option. So after you log in, it's going to take you to this screen. It's the default screen because it's what typically you're going to want to do, just transfer files. And in the web interface, this is simply a matter of logging into 2 endpoints and then using these to and from buttons here to send files back and forth. And there's a bunch of different options that you can use here, but it's generally a very simple interface. I think this is probably the strongest part of the online interface. So if I go back to here, if I just go to Managing Data, Transfer Files, I'm at the same page here. And now I can basically set up my transfer. And it even tells you, you need to start by selecting an endpoint. So let's do that. So if I select an endpoint, now here I've been playing around, so I have a lot of endpoints that I've used recently. This is nice. It kind of automatically remembers what you've recently done. You can also set up bookmarks, but let's say I don't have anything set up because I'm just starting out. So what you would do is you would go in this field up here, and you would search for existing endpoints. So in this case, I want to use that NCAR Glade. So I could just type NCAR, and a bunch of them will come up. Annoyingly, it kind of covers up the top one, but I can fix that by just typing NCAR Glade. And then if I click on that, it's going to log me right in here. Now, it did that because it remembered that I was on here recently. But if it's been a little while since you've been on there, since you've used Globus, it's going to ask you to authenticate with your username and YubiKey. So I think I can force that if I go over here and, oops. Oh. There is a place, oh, there it is. Deactivate credentials. So this is just saying, this is one nice thing as well, that once you activate with the YubiKey, it's going to remember that you've authenticated for a while. So if you're doing a lot of transfers in one day and you navigate away from this page, don't worry about having to type in or use the YubiKey every time, or a crypto card or whatever your authentication is. So now if I go over here, oh, it still remembered it. Okay, I can't fool Globus, but take my word for it that if you haven't logged in already, it's going to ask you to authenticate. And then obviously I need a destination, so I can select a second endpoint. In this case, I'm going to use CU's Research Computing. Ah, here we go. So it hasn't remembered that I've been on here recently. So I just type in my username, and for here they have a token system, so I'll type that in. Authenticate. And there we go. Now I'm in my home directory on both our Glade file systems here at NCAR and my home directory on CU's file system. Okay. Right, so you're going to need to use your account and YubiKey to authenticate for NCAR Glade. So there's a bunch of options. If you noticed, can go back again. If we scroll down, there's a bunch of options here, a bunch meaning 5. So not as many as perhaps a typical Unix command, but enough to think about. And each of these is kind of the typical things you would expect for a transfer protocol. So we have sync, delete files on destination that do not exist on source, preserve file modification times, verify the file after the transfer, and encrypt the transfer. So let's go through these. So sync. Sync means you only transfer new or changed files. That way, if I have a directory full of model output data and there's hundreds of files and maybe only 15 of them are new, it's not going to repeat that entire transfer and waste time and bandwidth. So that works similarly to the -u option for copy or secure copy. So it's only going to update files. Now this one's kind of interesting. Delete files on destination that do not exist on source. So if I have a directory in one place that has, say, 8 files, and then I have a directory in another place that has 4 files, and I transfer the 4 files to the place with 8 files, it's going to remove the files in that destination that aren't in my source directory. So it's going to make the 2 directories essentially match. That obviously can be a little dangerous. You want to make sure that the files in the destination, you're not concerned about losing them. But if you want 2 places to match exactly in terms of their file contents, this is an easy way to do it, and you don't have to do a ton of, different wildcards and things to match files and try to remove them manually. Preserve source modification times. This, again, is similar to Unix commands that allow you to do this, like copy. This is also an option in our HPSS commands. Now, I'd say be careful when using this on file systems with purges. For example, the scratch space on Glade, because if you have files that are older than I think it's currently 60 days, on another file system that doesn't have a purge, and you move it to, or you copy it to scratch, when the next purge cycle comes around, which is daily, it's going to remove those files because they're older than 60 days. Whereas if you do a typical copy, the modification time is going to be set to the copy time. So that does have use cases, obviously, but just be careful with that because you can have files disappear on you unexpectedly. This is a default option, so this is on by default. Verify file integrity. Basically inspects the checksum, which is a file fingerprint, to see if the source and destination copies match. This is simply a consistency check, a sanity check. So if it does a transfer and then it turns out that something got a little messed up during that transfer, it'll restart the transfer. If you don't have this on, it'll save you a little bit of time depending on how many files you have and how big they are. But if there are any inconsistencies or errors in there, you won't notice them until you go to use the files. And finally, encryption is kind of self-explanatory. The one note about this, it must be supported by the endpoints. So some endpoints will support encryption and some won't. And if an encrypted transfer fails, the likely cause is that one of the endpoints doesn't have that functionality. Okay. So as I said before, if a transfer is interrupted, Globus attempts to continue it for 3 days. This means that for 3 days from when I submit the transfer, if there's some interruption, it's going to keep trying over and over again to keep that start that transfer up again. After 3 days, it's finally going to say, okay, the connection seems irrevocably lost at this point, so I'm going to cancel it and then let the user know. But you don't have to manually restart transfers for those 3 days. It will try to restart it on its own. The one exception to that is if you manually cancel a transfer, it must be restarted from the beginning. So the checkpointing doesn't work in that way. It's not like you cancel some transfer and then an hour later you realize, oops, unfortunately you're going to have to start from scratch on that one. Okay. So using Globus to transfer files locally. You can also transfer files to and from an endpoint to your local workstation. And this uses a program called Globus Connect Personal. This is something you have to download and set up through the Globus online interface. You can also set it up through the command line interface, but I'll show you the online method. So basically what you do is you create an endpoint for your workstation, for your PC or your laptop. You get a setup key, and then you attach that to Globus Online, and then it recognizes that your laptop is an endpoint. And they have software for, for OS X, for Linux distros, and for Windows. So no matter what platform you're running on, you should be able to use this interface. Okay. So let's go through some examples of remote and local. So here from before, I'm at this transfer screen. I've logged in. I've got files. Now, if we're dealing with large files, odds are we're not going to be working on our home directories because they tend to be pretty small. So, you can simply set the path here in this path field. So if I go to Glade Scratch and then my username, and then I made a directory called Globus, and I can hit enter, it's going to pull up the contents of there, and right now I've got nothing in it. However, I did the same thing over here on the Lustre Scratch systems. Scratch. I can go there. Oops. So this is what happens if you put in a erroneous path. I think it's underscore. Yep. And then I have an equivalent directory over here called Globus. So this works very similar to any other GUI-based file system. I can enter folders just by double-clicking, and then I can query a little bit of information about files. So in this case, I've got a couple of different files that I've moved here. These I've renamed, but they're basically just, again, they're WARF data. So if I click on this large file, which as you can see is about 12 gigabytes, here's kind of some information you can get about it. You can make new folder. You can rename files through the web interface. You don't have to log into a terminal to do that. You can show hidden items. You can delete items. And then this get link is one of the sharing mechanisms. So, but if I want to transfer data from the CU systems to the NCAR systems, it's simply a matter of selecting the file and then clicking here. And then it's going to say that this request has been submitted, and it's going to give me a task ID. Up here it says I've got 1 active transfer. I have 3 failed from earlier. But there we go. So that's gone away, but we can easily query that by going to the activity screen. And here are all the transfers that I have done recently. And the green checks are obviously ones that have completed. It tells me when I did that. This one I canceled, this one I canceled. And if there was one that got interrupted, it would basically tell you when it was interrupted, and you could click on it for more information. So this one is currently active, so I can click on that and get details as to what I'm doing. So I'm transferring 1 file. It's pending. The one thing about this is it doesn't really auto-update. So, if you're really antsy about a file getting transferred, you're probably going to be hitting refresh quite frequently. I wish it kind of just had an auto-update functionality. But if I click refresh, we can see that now I've got the amount of data that's been transferred, which is a little over 10 gigabytes, so it's almost done. And the effective speed, which is 155.6 megabytes per second, which is pretty good. We can also see when it started. Here's this deadline, so it looks like they might have actually changed the ending time to 1 day after instead of 3 days after, so maybe it won't try to retry it as long. But that's one thing I've noticed too about Globus is some of their documentation doesn't seem to be completely up to date. I think they're changing things pretty quickly. So you might notice a couple inconsistencies like that. But it also tells me what I've selected to verify it's not encrypted and overwrite all files on destination. And I can also click the event log here, which this basically says, okay, here's when I've submitted it. It gives me a time. I can get some details. If you're curious, it tells you a little bit about the different settings for the amount of data streams. And then here it's telling me that it's done a performance monitoring event, which it just queries the transfer every so often. So it's not constantly checking it, but it'll check it for a periodic amount of time. And there we go, it's done. So the effective speed ended up being around 98 megabytes per second. This fluctuates, so the truly accurate time is going to be the time that it reports at the end. And then you can see I've transferred 12 gigabytes, and that was pretty fast. So now if I go back to transfer files, sometimes it saves your spot, and sometimes it doesn't. But now I can go back into these endpoints. If I just navigate here real quick. Now I can see that that file's there. And similarly, if I go into the terminal, I can log into Yellowstone and go to Glade Scratch my username, Globus, and there's the file. And if we look at the amount of the size, it's 12 gigabytes. So everything matches up and everything's consistent as we would expect. Now in the web interface, you can also move folders. That's simply a matter of doing the same exact thing, except you select a directory instead of a file. And of course, you can select multiple. So it works like any other GUI file system you would expect. So if I want to do this between Glade and my local desktop, that simply is a matter of setting up a personal endpoint. And if we go to my endpoints, I already have one here. This is my laptop. Just gave it the name. So here it's telling me that Globus Connect Personal is not running. So that's one thing about this. You need to have this program, which you download, running, because that provides Globus with basically the infrastructure on your PC to make that transfer. So I've already downloaded it here. It's this Globus Connect Personal. If I start it up, there we go. Now it says status idle. And it should now treat that as an endpoint. So now I'm looking at my local file system here. And I can go into the downloads directory if I want, and then transfer stuff back and forth. So let's do something small since I don't want to wait on it too long. Oh, I can upload the Globus download using Globus. How recursive. So it works the same way though. It sets up a transfer. That transfer gets logged. And now I can go here and find out details about it. And after a short amount of time, this is a pretty small file, it'll copy that file from my local computer to that space on Glade. So it's, once you get the initial setup done, it's pretty easy. And similarly to a batch job on Yellowstone, when a transfer is finished, Globus will send you an email notification. When I say finished, it doesn't mean successfully necessarily. It'll send you an email whether it successfully transfers or whether it fails or whatever the final state is. So if I go over here, back to the browser, sorry for the screen switching, but if I look at my email, I should have a couple. In fact, here's the one where I went from CU Research Computing to Glade, and it's telling me that that succeeded. And if I hit refresh, hey, there's the one from my laptop. And there's the endpoint, became named CISL Newton, and Glade is the destination. Now this is kind of an unwieldy name. You can certainly, if you go to transfer, you can give it a label, something that's a little clearer. So that's probably something that makes it a little easier to track what you've done. Okay, so just a little bit about the command line interface. So again, if you prefer, you can operate Globus using a CLI. this is where you need to have that Globus ID. So if you log in with NCAR RDA, for example, or you log in with a Google account or any other type of organizational account besides the Globus ID, you can't set this up because you need to link an SSH key, which basically allows Globus to access the command line interface server from Yellowstone or from whatever platform you're on. And you need to do that using the Globus ID account. And this is something that you would do on whatever file system or whatever cluster you're on. So in this case on Yellowstone, I could type this SSH keygen command. Then there will be a file created after it'll ask you if you want to set up a password, which you can do if you want. That way, whenever you log into this interface, it'll ask you for that password. That's just a little level of security, if you like. It wouldn't be the YubiKey. It would be just some text password that you set. And then it'll output this key to a file in your home directory in this hidden folder.ssh, this id_rsa.pub. You can use the cat command to output the contents of that file, and then you can copy and paste it into your Globus ID settings. And I'll show you where you can do that. So if we go back to Globus, and I go to Account, now if I'm logged in with a Globus ID account, I'm going to have this option, Manage SSH Keys. If I log in using a different type of account, that's not there. And that's one of the things that has, I think, provided some confusion for people trying to navigate this. So this takes you here, and you can see I have a Yellowstone key. If I didn't have a key and I needed to add one, simply hit Add a New Key. I would name it. I would say it's an SSH key. And then in this field right here, I'll make this a little bigger. In this field right here is where you paste the contents of that id_rsa.pub file. Then you would hit Add Key, and after that, you're able to use the command line interface. It's kind of strange that you have to use the online interface to set up the command line interface, but so be it. Okay, so now I'm not going to go through that process just because I don't really want to show my SSH key, but it is pretty simple to follow. So once that's set up, now here I'm on Yellowstone. As you can see, I just logged in. So the way I would access it is I would do SSH cli.globusonline.org. And if my username in Globus doesn't match my username on Yellowstone, then I would have to also prefix that with my username, as you would with any other SSH. So I can do that. And I set up a password for my SSH key, so I just have to type that in. And now I'm on the command line interface. And you can see it's fairly Spartan, but you can type this help command, and that gives you a summary of all of the available commands. And it's not a huge list, but it should be everything that you need, and it actually matches the functionality of the online interface as well. So the main things that you're probably going to be thinking about are, again, the transfer command. That's how you initiate a transfer. I like this wait command. Basically what it does is it kind of emulates the behavior of SCP. So if I do wait and then I give it the ID of a transfer, it'll lock the terminal screen down and give me a little progress bar and give me the speed of the transfer. So if I'm running multiple terminal windows, that basically tells me, okay, this one is dedicated to the transfer, and if I'm in the Globus web interface, that might make sense. Now, if you don't want to lock down your terminal, that's perfectly fine. But the other way to get details about your transfer, there's two commands, status and details. Details is simply a more verbose output, so it's going to give you quite a bit more detail. So actually, if I do, and all of these have help options, and they also have man pages, similar to Unix commands. So if I do status-h, for example, then I get the simple help here, and it says prints basic status information about tasks. And if I want to look at tasks that have already been completed, I can do that with this -a option. So I can do status-a, And you can see I get quite a bit of information about these past transfers, but it matches the information that I get from the online interface. Now, if I just want to look at one of them, let's say I want to look at this one, I have to copy this kind of ungainly task ID, and with a trackpad that might be hard, but so I can do status and then paste that, and it should just give me the one. Oops. So not all your commands are available, as that demonstrates right there. Now details gives you, again, a more verbose output. So if I click this, now it's going to tell me basically all the information that you see on that info dialog on the online interface. Now if I want to do a transfer, this requires you to have a little bit of information about the files that are available at your two endpoints and the locations where they're at. But the basic syntax, it's a little different. So you would do transfer and then dash dash, and then you're going to put the name of the endpoint. And in this case, it's a different name than the name that you use for the online interface. So the online interface, it has these very verbose names with spaces in them. These are just kind of antithetical to Unix. So there's, like for ncar, for example, we would do ncar GridFTP, and that's the name of the endpoint, the Glade endpoint. And then you can put the location of the file, so Glade scratch, and then file name. And then you would do the other one. So I think Colorado is similarly that. But these you can all look up, and these you can query through the command line interface or the online interface if you so desire. So I'm not going to run that at the moment. But again, if I want to get more details on transfer, I can always look at the man page. And then this is formatted exactly like any other manual page. And it'll tell you in more detail. Here's kind of an important point. You can't do globbing wildcards. So if you want to copy a bunch of files using the command line interface, it has to be as part of a directory using a recursive copy. Any questions? Okay. So put that. I'm going to leave that. So once you exit, it just returns you right back to where you were. In this case, I was on a Yellowstone login node, so that's where I am. Okay. Again, just SSH using your username in the Globus cli.globusonline.org. And to me, these are the most useful commands. Help, obviously. Transfer, wait, status, details, and the typical POSIX/Unix options are available to get help. So -H or a man page. Okay. One thing that we generally recommend, if you're logging into our systems only to do data transfers, you can log into the data access nodes instead of a login node. And for some users, if you don't have access to our compute infrastructure, but you have access to our file systems, then you have to log in using a data access node. So these allow you to have access to Glade, but not submit batch jobs. And if you don't have an allocation, but you want to access our file systems, you can submit a small data access request that's on our CISL page. And that allows you to obtain access. The important note, as usual, these nodes are not meant for computation, so don't be running intensive data processing scripts on there. You really shouldn't be running any data processing scripts on there. And expensive scripts will be terminated. That's similar to the login nodes. So use these nodes for their purpose, data transfers. And that's how you would log in. It's just SSH username at dataaccess.ucar.edu. One nice thing is if we have a downtime on Yellowstone, but Glade is still accessible, you can use these data access nodes to access the file system even if you can't log into Yellowstone. Now, if Glade's down, then you can't. But okay, so Glade users can also share data with non-Glade users using Globus. This is one, I think, really nice feature about it. So as we've seen, well, I guess I didn't demonstrate it, but as you will see, normal usage of Globus with Glade requires YubiKey, or crypto card. However, those with Glade allocations can make data available to others using the data sharing service. The general setup is fairly simple, but there's a couple steps involved. So you need to request a data share allocation. You need to create a shared endpoint. You need to copy files to the endpoint and set permissions. And then, of course, you need to let people know where to find it. Okay. So first you must request the sharing space. This space is on Glade. It's in Glade P data share, and it's intended for temporary short-term use. So, we certainly don't want people storing their climate runs in there just for another, storage point. The default quota is 50 terabytes. It's not backed up. And the storage location will typically be as follows: Glade P data share username. If you want to request sharing space, you can simply submit a ticket by contacting typical CISL help.ucar.edu, and then provide us some information as to your needs using that email. Assuming everything is approved, you'll receive an email invitation to have your Globus account added to the NCAR Data Sharing Service Group. This is a Globus group, not a Unix group. So this is something you manage through the Globus web interface. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. So if we go back to Globus, there's this tab up here, Groups. So I can click on that, go to My Groups. And you can see that I have a couple. I am a member of the Data Sharing Service. And if I click on that, it'll tell me, okay, this group is open by invitation only. So if you just search for NCAR, this will come up, and you might be like, well, what is this? You could contact the email, and what I would suggest is you can just go into Google and type CISL NCAR Data Sharing Service. And then it'll take you right to the page detailing what this is useful for and also the entire process for setting it up. But I'm already a member here, so it's listing it as one of my groups. Now, I'm not an administrator, so I can't really do all that much, but being a member of the group allows me to share data in this method. Now, I've also created a group of my own. This is a little tongue-in-cheek, Globus Workshop attendees. If you have a Globus account and you want to join, you can. I put the slides through this endpoint, so we'll make them available on the CISL tutorial archive as well. But if you want to download the slides now and give it a try, you can ask me to join this group. I'll approve you, and then you can use Globus to get the slides. You can see right now there's only one active member, myself. But if you wanted to join, you could go over here, search, and I could type CISL Globus, hit enter, and there it is, CISL Globus Workshop attendees. And the nice thing about groups is that groups allow you to basically sub-select the range of people, the range of users that you want to be able to use your endpoints. So let's say I want to use the data sharing service to provide data to all WARF users or all CESM users, but I don't want to allow just anybody to access it. I could use groups to require an invitation, approve people based on need. which brings me to the next step. If you're going to use the data share, this is also useful just in general. You can create a shared endpoint. Basically, the idea of a shared endpoint is basically a bookmark on the file system you're on. So if I'm using the Glade system endpoint, I can create a shared endpoint that points to a certain directory in my space and send that to somebody, so they don't have to hunt through my files to find it. Now in this case, we're using it as a bookmark to the data share location, which again is Glade P, data share for me would be Vander WB. So you create the subdirectory, well, it's created for you, but then you populate it with your data. And you can do this using Globus, or you can do it in the terminal with standard CP or move, and moving files, say, from your scratch space to this data share location. Then in Globus, you would select the subdirectory and click Share. I don't know why it left, but that's fine, because I'm going to go and do that. So if I go back to Manage Data, Transfer Files, and I go back to Glade, let's say I go to Glade P Data Share Me. So I have this folder here, Globus Workshop, and there's a little drop down here, and there's Share. So that's how I go about creating a shared endpoint. Now I already have one, so I don't want to duplicate my work, but I can go to endpoints up here, and it'll list all the ones that I've recently used, as well as the ones that are administered by me. And in here I have my laptop, and I also have this Globus Workshop files. So if I click on that, it gives me some details. Now, ncar Globus Workshop files is the name of the endpoint on the web interface. If somebody wants to access this through the command line interface, you would use the legacy name. And if you don't change this, it'll default it to it'll basically default to this long string. So I would suggest changing it, because that's a lot easier. So I changed to CISL Globus Workshop, and that's going to be Vander WB pound CISL Globus Workshop. The other important menu here is this sharing option. So if I go here, I can basically set permissions for who I want to be able to use this endpoint. Now what I've done here is, now I'm the administrator, so of course I have read and write access. But I have that group that I created, Globus Workshop attendees, and I've allowed them to read. So anybody who's a member of that group can read these files. Can't write to it though. Now if I wanted, I could say anybody who has a Globus account can read, and I can add that permission. Or I could even say anybody who anonymously accesses it can read. Now, I'm not exactly sure how you anonymously access, because it forces you to log in, but maybe that works through the command line interface. Although, no, because you have to use the yeah, I don't know. I don't know about public, but all users makes a lot of sense. Anybody who's logged into Globus can access the folder. I don't have that set here, though, so that's not the behavior right now. And since I've set that up, now I can go back to Transfer Files. Here I have Glade, and this is kind of silly, but I can go to my endpoint, and it's basically this folder. So you can see when I loaded up that endpoint, I didn't have to navigate to this location on the file space. It just says that's the root of this endpoint, is that bookmark essentially on the Glade file system. So it saves the users of your endpoint a little bit of searching, and it also allows you to only have them looking at the files you want them to look at. And again, since we're using the data share, the nice thing is you don't need to authenticate to access it. And as I mentioned, you can use groups to subset the users who can access. So if I created a group, this would be the dialog. It's very simple. I give it a name, I give it a description. I say who can see it. Is it all Globus users, or is it group members only? And then this is that same screen I showed. Okay, so these are some, in my opinion, questions we get pretty frequently about Globus, or just about file transfers in general on our systems. So one is, can I use Globus to transfer files from the tape archive from HPSS? Not directly. So there's no interface to pull a file from tape and send it through Globus to another file system. But what you can do, and this is what you would do, is you would move the file from HPSS to Glade. You could use HSI or you could use HTAR, and then use Globus to transfer it elsewhere. So it's just a two-step process. Now, of course, that means that you have to have enough free space in one of your Glade storage locations to make this happen. But otherwise, it's fairly simple. And you could put that all into a batch job and submit it to a queue and have it run in the background, essentially. Should I archive collections of files when using Globus? So for example, if I have 67 gigabytes of large data files, is it a better idea to send those as the individual files in a directory, or is it a better idea to tar them up and send the tarball? What's going to be more efficient? So you may have an idea of this already if you've tried to do this with SCP. But the single tarball, that's the transfer speed I got. Now again, this fluctuates, but I got 112 megabytes per second. Took about 10 minutes. With the 9 separate files, I got quite a bit faster speed, actually. It took 7 minutes to transfer. And that's on top of, it took 22 minutes to actually tar. So you are vastly better off in this scenario by transferring the files separately. Now you can set that all up in one transfer, but it'll do each file instead of tarring it up beforehand. Now I was thinking, okay, maybe with small data files it would help. So here I have 68 gigabytes of small data files. Again, a single tarball at this time of day, it was after hours and I was getting a bit better speed, 171 megabytes per second, 6 minutes. But with the separate files, I get half the time, double the speed. And again, compression, or not, actually no compression, that would take even longer. Just archiving took 20 minutes. So generally, no. And the reason is that archiving the files into one file prevents parallelism. If it can operate on multiple files at one time, you're generally going to get better performance. Yes? So the question is, if you're using SCP, would it make sense to do this? And I think there there's more of an argument to be made because you're not preventing parallelism. But again, it's going to be, it's really, you're going to have to take into account how long it takes to tar it up. And in my experience, most of the time, that time it takes to tar it is going to make it disadvantageous. But there are situations where it's useful. Right. Yeah, that's another good point. The point was made that if it's a tarball with SCP, for example, since you can't restart an interrupted transfer, if it fails, then you have to start from the beginning. Whereas if you transfer a bunch of files independently, maybe some of them will finish before the interruption. So that's a good point. So yeah, I would pretty strongly advise against doing that. I guess an interesting question would be if you have a tarball, would it save time to untar it and then transfer? And that's where you're going to have to determine how long does it take to untar versus how much time you save in the transfer. And that's a hard thing to estimate sometimes. Okay, so another question is, what if I can't get access to an endpoint on one of my systems? So this unfortunately doesn't really have a Globus workaround. This just means you can't use Globus to do that transfer. But we do document an alternative on our documentation. There's another program kind of analogous to SCP called BBCP. Now this is like SCP, but it uses parallelism, so you get better speed. You don't get as good a speed as Globus generally, but you get better speed than SCP. And this can be useful when Globus can't be used. Now the only thing you need to do to set this up is that each system, that you're basically the destination and the source, both need to have the BBCP binary to perform the file transfer. But the nice thing is that the binary is small. It's only about a megabyte. So I tested this out with, again, the CU systems. They didn't have BBCP by default, but I just, put that binary on there and added it to my path, and then I was good to go. It's already installed and in your path on Yellowstone, so if you just type BBCP in the terminal, I can do that here, you'll see it finds it, and then it gives me, it says you didn't specify files, but here's how it would work. So this is a command line option. There's no other interface for this. And if you use certain options, interrupted transfers can be resumed. I've found this to be a little flaky because sometimes it'll set permissions in such a way that the checkpoint file can't be read, and then it'll just cancel the transfer. So I would say those are options that you may need to play around with, but in ideal situations, it can allow you to restart. And something to note about BBCP, file transfers to Yellowstone, to the Glade file systems, should be run from the data access nodes. File transfers from Yellowstone don't need to be, but this has to do with basically security settings. And if you try to run file transfers to Yellowstone, sending it, say, from the login nodes, a lot of time it'll just block the transfer. And that can be tricky to figure out if you're not sure what's not allowing you to set up the transfer. This is my little, so here's an example. It's a bit cumbersome, but basically what these two settings are doing is it's setting that parallelism in the same way that Globus does. Here I'm asking it to be verbose. These are the settings that you can use to allow checkpointing, this -A and -K. So you can try that, but if you have trouble with checkpointing, you can remove those, and it'll run, just won't checkpoint the file. So if there's an interruption, you'll have to start from the beginning. And then you specify, the source file and the destination file, or vice versa. So the BBCP speed that I got was 76 megabytes per second, and right afterwards I did a Globus transfer, and it was 179 megabytes per second. So you're losing quite a bit, but it's still a lot better than that SCP speed of 20 to 30 megabytes a second. So this is an option you can use if there are no endpoints on the other system and the sysadmins, for whatever reason, won't set it up. Okay, now of course, there's plenty of documentation out there. We have our documentation, which covers all of the methods I've talked about today, located there. The Globus documentation, so this is another thing about Globus. If you click documentation, it actually takes you to the documentation for the API if you want to program a Globus front end. Probably not that useful for your purposes. But if you go to the how-to section of the documentation, that's kind of the user section. So there it'll tell you, if I say how to make a transfer, then it'll give you that in detail. And then here's a man page for BBCP if you want to read more about the options for that.